Spanish. The second is for potential partner countries, and the third is for observers, supporters, NGO partners, and private sector participants, etc. The second and the third will be moderated in English. If you haven't already, please notify Tokolo in the chat. Tokolo, please go ahead and put a comment in the chat so people know how to find you, and indicate which of those 3 breakout rooms you want to be part of. And to everyone during the session, please put any questions you have in the chat or use the raise hand function to indicate that you have a question or a comment, and Francisco will pick these up from the chat and address them in turn. Thank you so much. And without further ado, over to you, Susie. Welcome. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That's wonderful. So I'm just going to share my screen. So what I'm going to do is talk you through just the basic idea of what Climate Teams is to provide some basis for the conversation, focused on high integrity transfers of international mitigation to enhance global emissions. So key messages, as we all know, the world needs to transition to net zero emissions, and it needs to do it fast. And we know that if we are able to do effective transfers across countries, that will help us go faster. Transfers across countries where one country is providing resources in the form of finances, technical capability, possibly new technologies, in exchange for additional mitigation that goes even further than countries' own nationally determined contributions, is a hard thing to do, and it requires some shared vision between the countries who are collaborating, trust, and true collaboration. So we argue that this is something that goes beyond arm's length transactions. And third, a climate team is one mechanism that will help to mobilize the acceleration of transition in developing and emerging economies. It's a large scale mechanism, and it's done among small groups of countries. It's not the only mechanism, but what we've tried to do is design one that would really achieve large scale, high integrity emissions reductions. So as we know, global ambition is insufficient to achieve the goals that we've got of stabilizing temperature increase well below 2 degrees. The black line here is a projection of business as usual global emissions. The blue is what we would achieve if all countries did what they have promised to do in their nationally determined contributions. And the green line is one line that would be consistent with achieving 2 degrees. So what we're trying to do is push that blue line down below the green line. That requires 11 billion tonnes more of reductions every year. So this is a huge challenge. And by one estimate, this isn't from the IPCC, that requires more than 2.4 trillion in clean investment for the energy sector transition alone. So what I want you to take away from this slide is simply the scale of the issue. Climate stability requires that all countries reach net zero emissions ultimately. And we might expect that countries like New Zealand, which is my country, the European Union or the United States would achieve that fairly rapidly, certainly before 2050, which is when many countries are setting net zero goals. But you mightn't expect that from countries that are less developed, that may still have emerging economies. So for example, we might expect that Chile, which still has quite rapidly growing emissions, would slow its growth, peak, turn, and then maybe meet its target. It also has a net zero target in 2050, but along the way that would happen at a slower pace. A country like China has a net zero target now, thankfully, for 2060, but they again might not go directly down towards that target. They may do it more slowly. And a country like Kenya may take longer still, simply because they have competing priorities. If we're going to have globally efficient transformation, and globally efficient would make it easier for us to have faster transformation, which means we will stabilize at a lower temperature. One estimate is that efficient mitigation would require 2 to 4 billion tonnes of transfers per year between countries. For context, under the Clean Development Mechanism since it started, in total, there have been 4 billion tonnes of transfers. So we need to move to doing that every year. So to get large-scale, high-integrity units, we need to have no double counting. We need to be sure that these are fitting within the Paris Agreement targets. We need to have high ambition by the host and the partner countries. We need those countries to not be making short-term reductions, but to actually have long-term plans towards net zero commitments and have credible plans for transformation. Ideally, those are economy-wide, covering all sectors and sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We need multi-year commitments because this is not a one-off problem, it's something that accumulates over time. And we need strong monitoring, reporting and verification so we can support and build and enhance ambition. So how can we create that mechanism? This is the challenge that our climate team initiative set itself. We don't consider that mitigation is a commodity. A better model for thinking about long-term mitigation and transfers between countries is long-term relational contracts. That what we're building is a relationship between the country who wants to support additional mitigation and the country in which that additional mitigation will actually occur. In some countries, there could be relationships that are so strong between the two countries. In some cases, for example, between California and Quebec, the relationship is very strong, there's strong cultural ties, and that has enabled full emissions trading system linkage. But in general, the relationships between very different countries, which are the relationships we need in order to get global reductions on a large scale, that's between developed countries and developing countries or emerging economies. And so we're probably not going to have relationships that allow us to have linked emissions trading systems, even if we did have emissions trading systems in both countries. The existing links between emissions trading are all among countries that are already developed. So can we utilize existing trust relationships that do exist between developed and developing countries to support trading relationships, but ones that are less commodity market related and more long-term relational contracts? So what we're trying to do is build trust to manage the uncertainty in the supply of units. It's very difficult to mitigate, as those of us who have tried hard for the last 20 years have found. And so the host countries are also finding it difficult to mitigate. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, host countries now have commitments under the Paris Agreement, and that means that they need to achieve their commitments of their nationally determined contributions before they can transfer any units to partners. If they transfer units to other countries and not to the partners they're working with in an agreement, like the sort of climate teams agreement, then there are fewer available within the agreement. If units are transferred to others, there's a higher risk that there just won't be enough units to meet the needs of the partner countries. And the reason the partner countries are engaged in this is partly because they want to have units to meet their own commitments. Any uncertainty about national determined commitment, contribution compliance falls on the host country primarily because they are trying to meet their commitments, but it also falls on those who haven't yet received the units that they're seeking. So to manage this uncertainty, one of the key parts of a climate team's proposal is that it's a small group of countries. So suppose a country like Chile decides that they would like to explore developing one of these, they would choose countries with whom they already have trust relationships and a small group of countries who they think can work effectively together. So that might be countries like New Zealand, it might be Canada or California, it might be Switzerland, all countries where there are trading relationships and existing strong relationships. So then how do those countries work together? What actually generates the units? How do you measure the emissions reductions that are able to be transferred? So the climate team does this at a national level. So this is national CO2 equivalent emissions. And the blue line is business as usual emissions for a fictitious country. This country has taken a commitment to get below that business as usual level of emissions. And based on that, we can negotiate a crediting baseline for the host country. Because it's on a large scale at the level of the emissions inventory, the whole country, and because the country has already committed to reduce below BAU, that makes this a pretty credible baseline, that if you can go below that purple line, it's very likely that those are truly additional reductions that would not have happened otherwise. And then we use the inventory system. We already create inventories. They're not always as strong as they could be, and they need to continue to be improved, but they exist. We produce them. We could produce them more often. And they are done under a standard set of rules. So even if they're not accurate, they are harder to manipulate, and we can see what's done. There's a transparency around the process. That makes it a more credible system for assessing the emissions that are actually occurring. It also means that it's low transactions cost because these are things that we're doing already. So the difference in emissions here, the target emissions defined by the crediting baseline relative to the actual emissions defined by the inventory, that is the amount of emissions reductions that are available for transfer. So another key aspect of the climate team agreement is that because it's done on the basis of total national emissions, it can be used to support any domestic policy. It is not only there to support specific projects or to link to an emissions trading system. The way that the emission reductions is done is chosen by the host country. And that could be a variety of different approaches. So in this example, this host country might be doing some RADD at the jurisdictional level in some parts of the country. Those could generate units that would be that might be additional that the host could use. It might have a transport policy that is changing infrastructure, that is strengthening public transport, and that they think through that they can reduce fossil fuel use. That could contribute to lowering emissions and creating emissions that could be shared, that could be traded. Or they could choose to use a domestic emissions trading system or a tax, and that could be part of the policy mix as well. That generates units that, when it's been shown that there really are units and the country really has gone beyond the crediting baseline, they're available to transfer to the partner countries, who in the meantime are helping. They might be helping get finance, they might be providing technical support, they might be doing capacity building work with the host country. So how does a climate team operate? You have the countries who are the partner countries, and now that they have a real interest in the host country actually achieving their NDC, because they only get units once you go beyond the NDC, they have an interest in focusing their climate finance effort, and those are the efforts where they're not getting any credits in return or any ITMOs in return, and they have a real incentive to make sure that climate finance is effective. Then we need to negotiate between the partners and the host, something like a guaranteed minimum price that will protect the host country so they can be sure that they will get adequate reward if they make extra efforts, but also a high price that provides assurance to the partners that the units that they buy are going to be available at a reasonable price. Based on that price range, the partner countries will commit to providing a certain amount of resources if the country is successful, because there's no point in agreeing a price if you don't know how many units are going to be bought at that price. That funding provides some level of certainty to the Chilean government that if they are successful, they will get the flow of resources coming. That funding is a large amount of money. Most treasury departments, even in relatively wealthy countries like New Zealand, are going to find it very difficult to commit the potentially billions of dollars in advance to buy these units. So they may ask companies in their own countries to contribute some of this finance in return for enabling them to use some of those units for their own domestic compliance, for example, within an emissions trading system. That funding goes potentially into something like, I've made this up, a Chilean climate fund, where it's sitting there ready to be released when the units are actually achieved. So if there are additional reductions, this has been shown through the inventory, the payments then flow out of that fund and through to the Chilean government. And then the ITMOs, or the internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, are transferred to the partner countries according to the agreement, and corresponding adjustments are made. All of this requires that there is also external observers though. As we know, it's very tempting for both the buyers and the sellers in any agreement like this to make the terms of the agreement easier, to make the baseline easier, to make it easier to generate units that then can be transferred. So you need to have external observers watching what's happening, looking at the crediting baseline, making sure that the rules are being followed, to assure outsiders that this is genuine effort, that we really are enhancing ambition. And those observers then, we hope, are inspired to increase their own ambition, and you get that positive spiral of reciprocity that increases ambition globally. So it's not just a contract, it involves governance structures and a lot of trust building. You don't know what's going to happen over time, over the next 5 years, let alone the next 10, 15, 20, which is what is required for genuine transformation. So it's important that these countries are working together, they trust each other, they can observe what each other are doing, that they're all actually making genuine efforts to help accelerate the partner country, the host country's transformation. It also, because they're closely related to each other, they can provide political support for each other. It's hard to do mitigation within any country, even if the country is going to receive resources for that. You still have to convince people domestically, and being able to say that you're part of a wider effort is often helpful. Also, the countries can provide mutual learning. For example, New Zealand can definitely learn from a country like Chile in terms of how you increase the amount of solar within a grid, and how to invest more in solar. We can all learn together on new technologies such as hydrogen and how that might be developing. So, in summary, to design a climate terms agreement, we need to address critical issues. The first one is environmental integrity. All of this means nothing if this is not actually accelerating transformation. Second, efficiency. This is a hard problem. We want to do it with all the tools that are available. We want to make sure there's the right flexibility for the country, that they have access to the resources that they need, that we can build confidence that in the seriousness of the effort, so that we can attract investment and get the country to make systemic changes. Equity is critical, working out how we share the gains and also the risks. And finally, endurance, anticipating some of the changes which we know are going to happen, but also creating governance structures and relationships that will allow us to respond to changing conditions. So think large and small. We know this is a large-scale problem. We need to cooperate on large-scale reductions. That requires that we're brave. It requires large multi-year agreements, but this is critical if we're going to actually succeed. But work in small groups of countries. We're trying to cooperate. We know that it's hard to get cooperation among large groups of countries. It's much easier among small groups. We've done this before on other issues, and we can learn from that experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susie.
And I think now I need to introduce Francisco, who is going to give us a bit of an update on what the Climate Terms Initiative has been doing. So Francisco Pinto is based in Santiago, Chile. He's an economist. He has a master's in public policy from the University of Chile and a master's in science and environmental economics and climate change from the London School of Economics. He has over 15 years experience in analyzing, designing, and evaluating public policies in general and environmental climate policies in particular in both the public sector and in civil society. Francisco was part of the technical team that worked on the implementation of the first green taxes in Chile between 2015 and 2018. So we're very lucky that he is a core part of our team. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you, Susie, and good morning and good afternoon at the same time to our audience. I want to share my screen. Can you see it? Great. So I will present a brief update about where the initiative is at. It's important to mention that the Climate Team Initiative started in 2017, and that the initiative focuses on how to accelerate greenhouse gas mitigation under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We work with a range of different institutions from civil society, the academy, and the private sector, as well as officials from various governments. We are already working with the Catholic University of Chile, MOTU from New Zealand, Seoul National University of Korea, the Universidad de los Andes from Colombia, and Perspectives Climate Research. So we engage with technical people from institutions in many countries, including Korea, New Zealand, Chile, Colombia, Switzerland, and the US. We have run an array of different seminars, conversations, and webinars like this one. And we have also had a round of preliminary conversation with government representatives from Chile as a potential first host country, and New Zealand and Switzerland as potential partner countries. It's interesting to mention that in Chile, we have an interministerial technical group to address particular issues emerged from Article 6. This interministerial group is comprised by the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In our next stage of work, we will to explore this initiative. We want to understand from an economic, legal, and technical, and also institutional point of view. We also want to learn and understand what are the issues related with potential implementation of climate teams in a specific context. We have a website if you want to understand more about these initiatives. If you want to read some documents we have available in our website, a sort of brochure explaining what is the climate teams, this new model of climate cooperation. And we also prepared a sort of policy brief related specifically with the potential implementations of climate teams in Chile as a proposal to combat both climate change and the local pollution, which is the main atmospheric environmental problem in Chile. So if you have any questions, or if you have any doubt related with the initiative or any particular issue related with this, you can send me an email. You can see it in the screen. And also you can visit the website climatechange.org. So the next part of our webinar is a discussion panel, which will be moderated by Chandra Sekar from the World Bank. Let me introduce you properly. So, Chandra, thank you very much for your support. Chandra Sekar is an advisor in the climate change group of the World Bank. Mr. Sinha's work at the Climate Change Group focuses on the development of next generation carbon markets and leveraging climate finance for Paris alignment of bank operations. Chandra joined the World Bank in 1997 as part of the design team for the prototype carbon fund, through which carbon finance was established at the World Bank, and was the team leader for operations for the carbon finance unit till 2006. So before Chandra, it's important to mention that if you have any questions for the next panel, please send me your question by chat. You have a chat box in the right side of your screen. So please let me know if you have any question, and then I will pass them to Chandra. So Chandra, the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Susie, Kelly, and EDF for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion. As Kelly indicated, with the delays in agreement on Article 6 and broadly, delay in moving forward with the operationalization of the kind of minilateral or plurilateral collaboration, as Kelly referred to it, as a part of trying to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think initiatives such as the climate teams is extremely important, and Susie has highlighted how potentially this can facilitate movement of the implementation process through a cooperation between countries. The World Bank has a similar initiative in partnership with other multilateral development banks, which we call the Climate Market Club. The effort is complementary. The goal is very similar. The focus is slightly different. Since we work on with developing countries, we recognize the challenges that many of our client countries will face in putting together the institutions and the institutions and the processes and building the capacity to go forward with the new framework under Article 6. And the idea of the Climate Market Club is to facilitate the process of piloting for Article 6 through sharing of experiences and bringing together the learning, very much like the way the climate teams attempts to do. I think the idea for the Climate Market Club would be to design modalities and procedures for piloting, and most importantly, come to an agreement on institutional arrangements that could facilitate moving forward with the operationalization of Article 6, recognizing that the international agreements may not provide all the guidance that may be necessary for countries to develop their own capacity internally. So one of the important differences from the climate team's concept is that the club is not a legal entity. It is a platform for sharing knowledge and experience. It does not make any purchase commitments, but will focus on developing template documents which would allow these contractual arrangements to be put in place. General terms and conditions of purchase, specific provisions that would help countries with Article 6.2, for CORSIA, for Article 6.4, a whole range of financial products such as option contracts and things of that nature. So the idea is to provide template documents, develop institutional arrangements, put in general policy framework that countries can put in place, which then facilitates the contractual arrangements and the actual implementation of the arrangements. The Climate Market Club takes advice from a IETA convened advisory group, which currently has around 18 private sector entities which meet regularly to advise on various aspects of the work that needs to be done. And the Climate Market Club also engages the best available expertise to prepare what we call approach papers which then countries within the Climate Market Club utilize to customize it for their own national circumstances and institutions. The total target for us is to have about 15 countries in the club. 9 have already formally communicated participation in the Climate Market Club, of which Chile is one of them. And there are, several countries who have active piloting program, such as Switzerland, Sweden, Japan, who are part of the Climate Market Club as well. So I think, before we hear from the panel on a broader requirement on the kind of plurilateral arrangements that can facilitate implementation of Article 6, I wanted to emphasize that more efforts of this nature, like climate teams or Climate Market Club, are needed in order to get our partner countries to understand how to move the discussion forward. So we'll hear from a very distinguished panel, as you will see. Because we are running a little behind time, I will, as a moderator, try to manage the time a little bit, and I will introduce the speakers as they are about to speak. So we will start with Rodrigo Pizarro. He's an economist trained at the London School of Economics and is currently the director of Quota 21, which is a consultancy firm focused on environmental economics and policy. He has worked at the Ministry of Environment in Chile, and he was responsible for the green growth strategy for Chile, design and implementation of Chile's environmental taxes, among many other things. And Rodrigo will speak to us about the needs of the public sector in putting in place these kind of arrangements which would facilitate the implementation of Article 6 and broadly cooperation between countries to achieve Paris goals. So Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chandra. I'm trying to, I have a very brief presentation with a few slides. I'm wondering how to share my screen, and I wonder if you can see it now. Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for climate teamwork, EDF, Francisco and Susie, for this invitation. I have just a very brief notes. I've been advised to speak no more than 5 minutes, so I will try and keep as much and try and complement Susie's presentation with a very broad view from the developing countries and some of the problems that we face in the public sector in developing countries. For that, I'm wondering if you can see this diagram, the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I like this diagram because it's something I took from World Bank data, and here you can see how the climate change mitigation problem can be viewed. Now, we can think of it here in the blue bars, you see emissions, and in the orange bars, you see forest cover. So we know that climate change mitigation is an issue of reducing emissions, but also possibly capturing emissions through nature-based solution types approaches. If we look at this diagram in one sense, we see that climate mitigation is really a problem of 3 or 4 countries: China, the USA, the European Union, India, and Russia. And if we look at it this way, what we'll find is that we will not be able to face climate change mitigation, and we will not be able to deal with it in the time frame that we have, because if we bring all the others together, you'll see, and I can't see it because I'm looking at the video. Let me see if I can put this down. Yeah, there we are. If we look at all the other countries, you see that most of the rest of the world is where most of the emissions are and where most of the forest cover is. So therefore, if we really want to face climate change mitigation, then we have to deal with an enormous amount of countries that have carbon emissions and forest cover, and they have to be involved in climate mitigation. Now, what the problem that these countries have is that they are very small, and their capacity to actually deal with climate change and forest conservation or other nature-based pollution is very limited. Now, this is one of the conclusions of this diagram. The other conclusion, of course, is since we have such a broad number of countries and there is so much interest in global climate mitigation, why hasn't a carbon market emerged? Now, there are two principal reasons that we can take from standard economic theory. And the two main ones, there are others, of course, but the two main ones is for a market to emerge, there must be gains from trade. And presently, there are very few gains from trade from carbon emissions reductions. Unless, of course, there is some kind of regulatory structure or institutionalization to deal with to internalize the social cost of carbon emissions. Now, with the success of the Paris Agreement, this is provided by the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So therefore, there's a possibility of gains from trade from these carbon emission reduction market. The second reason, of course, is that market exchange is too costly. And the reason for that is that transaction costs are too high. So in order to have some kind of emissions market, we need to deal with the gains of trade and we need to deal with the transaction costs. Unfortunately, currently we have been very much influenced by the economics of carbon markets from the neoclassical approach, in which it envisions a market as a frictionless space without transaction costs. And that has brought us to thinking exclusively almost of carbon markets in terms of ETS and linkage. Now, the problem with that, although this is good for some countries, the problem for that is that developing countries simply do not have the institutional capacity to be able to link or to be able to implement ETS successfully. And mainly because it's an emission reduction market project, its project size are simply too small. And the transaction cost for such a number of multiple trades is too high. And this is one of the problems that we've seen with the clean development mechanism, voluntary type approaches, and so forth. It is very difficult for countries which are very small, that make an enormous contribution to carbon emissions, but individually are very small, to actually participate in this carbon market. The advantage, of course, that we have with climate teams, and with this I'll finish.
Warning, please. 5 minutes.
Yes, I'll just finish with this.
Thank you.
The advantage, of course, that we have with climate teams is that it takes a different approach from project-based market mechanisms. And rather what it does, it deals with small cooperative groups. So therefore, what it does essentially is solves the transaction cost problem which public sector has and which developing countries have. So therefore, we can use this as a carbon market exchange model, in effect, by reducing these high transaction costs. Just to finish off and just show you this diagram, we have experience across the world in dealing with these types of country-to-country type of agreements. Here on the right, you'll see a diagram of the evolution of regional trade agreements. And you'll see that we have over 500 regional trade agreements across the world, which are precisely agreements between governments on trade issues. Whereas in the case of carbon pricing instruments and linkage, we have very limited experience. So therefore, in sum, I would like to say that the climate team approach solves the principal problem that we have seen for the lack of a carbon emissions market, and that has to do with the transaction costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo, and apologies for interrupting, but just to give an opportunity at the end to the audience to participate in question and answers. Our next speaker is Axel Mikhailova. Most of you will know Axel for his more than 25 years of work on carbon markets. He's the research director and a founding partner of Perspectives, which is one of the partners in the climate teams process. And he's actively involved in working on the conceptual framework and the piloting activities of Article 6. Axel will give us his perspective on vision from the international community, particularly as it pertains to environmental integrity. Axel, over to you, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Chandra. Sorry, I just had some issue with screen sharing. Let me just try again. One moment, please. I will be on very quickly. Good. So I would like to focus on the key aspect of environment integrity in the context of upscaled Article 6 approaches. So of course, the key, as has been said previously, is that the upscaling is the aspect that makes this approach really compelling. But of course, this upscaling also means one needs to be very careful with regard to the question of additionality. And we've seen other upscaling approaches where the additionality question has been looming large. And we, of course, have this issue that in the world of Paris, with the nationally determined contribution, we could have the issue of hot air in the NDCs. And then we would have to get all this transaction cost intensive additionality testing back in. Now, of course, the climate team's approach tries to have an approach where the baseline is actually significantly below business as usual and therefore would allow us to skip additionality testing. So the big question, and where the countries need to work together very closely, is to actually ensure the credibility of this below business as usual. And then, of course, we have another aspect, because nowadays there is a lot of discussion about how the market mechanisms can be made net zero proof, how I would like to call it. So that, of course, means one would need to align the baselines with the path towards net zero emission. The climate team's approach, of course, allows to do this on the national level. So principally, it's very well adapted to that. But of course, we have then the political challenges in actually addressing it. And on the right-hand side, you see here the pathways for Chile until 2050. So you see we have a rising baseline, business as usual scenario, rising NDC, and then we have a high mitigation scenario. On the bottom, you see, of course, what would have to be done by emerging economies for the 1.5 degree compatibility. And I think China's announcement yesterday was exactly showing this, because if China says now 2060 net zero, that of course means that by 2060, yeah, it would not be possible to actually sell any ITMOs from such a country. For the climate teams to work in the long term, we need to have really a good forward-looking approach that, for example, looks into what could be the contribution of negative emission technologies for the climate team's approach. And yeah, the transition from selling emission reduction credits to negative emission credits. So these would be some thoughts that I would really be looking forward to discuss in the further development of the climate team's approach. And yeah, if the approach can solve these issues, then it of course has a bright future also in the long term. Thank you very much, and back to Chandra.
Thank you, Axel. If we had a trading system for a time made up, you would have a credit. Thank you for helping us make up the time a little bit. Hopefully we'll come back to some question and answers with you as well. Our next speaker is Claudio Sibach. Claudio is a industrial electrical engineer from the Catholic University with a training at the Catholic University of Chile, and then a master's degree from Stanford University. He is currently the executive chairman of Generadora de Chile, which is the business association of the Chilean electricity generators. And we've asked Claudio to speak about the need of the private sector to develop an effective agreement and how potentially the private sector can participate in this arrangement that Susie and others have described. So over to you, Claudio.
Thank you, Chandra. Well, thank you very much for having the chance to share a little bit the view from the private sector. And I'd like to thank Susie and Francisco and my predecessors to introduce the broader aspect. But let me make an analogy of what Susie was showing in how this would work towards what the private sector has done, particularly the power generation sector in the energy transition in Chile. And how these things, why the reasons we've been, in a way, Chile pretty successful. First is trust. Chile's renewable investment, which by now, and if you looking at the NDC, 60% roughly of the emission reductions of the NDC by 2030 will come from the power sector. Why has been the power sector so successful? Basically, because we have been able to have, not only because we have resources, of course we have no fossils and we have a lot of sun and we have historically water and wind, etc., but because we have a trust in our regulations, in our economy. And it has been a long-term regulatory quality that brings in investment. So the first aspect is that trust is extremely relevant in private sector to deploy and to act. The second one is that Chile I would make an analogy to the aspect of collaboration. Chile has been also very successful in, and Rodrigo was showing, in the amount of a free trade agreement and the openness of our economy to new investors, to new innovation, to new human capital. So pretty much every new innovation in technology is very quickly adopted into our our electric system, which is a highly competitive market. So those are the, and then there's a third one, which, and also again, Susie brought in, it's the long-term vision. Unlike other countries, if there's one thing in Chile where you have a shared common vision between government, NGOs, and private sector, is about climate change. We have committed to a 2050 net carbon zero scenario. We have agreed on an NDC, which is, there is no outcry for any particular sector in Chile against this, which again brings in a private sector which is intensive in capital investment to do that investment with a long-term vision. If you have only short-term vision, you really you're not willing to invest large amounts of money. And that's just finally the drivers between the, so to say, the success of the energy transition. But until now, the energy transition has been mainly only driven by the power generation sector, which of course, as we know, is in the case of Chile, in many countries, a large emitter, but it's going from being the culprit of many of the emissions in being a big opportunity of the emissions abatement, but particularly if you use electricity in another aspect, where again, trust, collaboration, and long-term vision has been, let's say, electric mobility. We have by now the largest fleet of electric mobility in public transport. And that brings in another aspect. Is to be successful is not only that you're able to have quality of regulation, if you have long-term vision, if you have the capacity of attracting capital, but you also have to connect it to more immediate aspects. The pandemic has shown us that we need to address, of course, immediate economic recovery. And economic recovery will need, in the first time, creation of employment, creation of investment. So some people say, you know what, forget about climate change, let's focus on employment and investment. Well, it's possible to align those things. And then there is the final point I'd like to make from a private sector aspect, is that if you connect it with the equity aspect, let's say public transport. Public transport is one of the greatest opportunities in emissions reductions we have. And it's very efficient. And that it also solves an equity issue. Public transport immediately solves problems for millions of lives in much faster than, let's say, private electric mobility. And so equity. And finally, there's another one, and which we haven't talked much about, is co-benefit. Chile's largest environmental problem is air pollution from the central south of Chile with basically heat by biomass, wood, and public transport, mainly use of diesel. If we're not able to connect those, and the private sector as an actor, because the private sector finally does the investment, the deployment, etc., it's going to be very hard. So the idea of these teams where private sector can act quickly and can connect through these spaces is really attractive. But of course, there are many aspects that need to be solved in order for a private sector to commit to investment, which is the certainty, trust, long-term vision to really do those investments. That's kind of what I'd like to share for an initial approach. I hope we have some time to bring up some more detailed questions I would have.
Thank you, Claudio. That's very helpful to understand the terms under which the private sector can get the confidence under a broad government-to-government agreement to participate and contribute with investment. So we'll come back to some of those aspects because we are doing reasonably well with time. Next speaker is Diana Movius. Diana is the Director of Global Forest Policy at Climate Advisors in Washington, D.C. She has more than 15 years of experience working on REDD+ issues with a wide range of initiatives, including the UN Forum on Forests, World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and most interestingly, she's lived and worked in the Peruvian Amazon researching community-based ecotourism, and someday I'd like to learn more about that from her. But today, we have asked her to speak about the opportunities for the REDD activities within the Climate Teams Initiative or broader arrangements around cooperation between countries. So Diana, over to you.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Chandra, and for the invitation, Susie and Francisco. EDF has just asked me to share 2 slides of key points, so I'm going to quickly do a screen share here. Oops, and hopefully you should be, sorry. There we go. Hopefully everyone is now seeing the presentation. Modest technical difficulty. So again, my name is Diana Movius. I'm here to talk quickly about how climate teams can relate to REDD+ and could possibly include REDD+. And the first point I'd like to make is that climate teams can include REDD+. Sometimes there can be a perceived disconnect between REDD+ and the long amount of negotiation and guidance that that's had and what is currently being discussed under Article 6 and under potential cooperative approaches and ITMO arrangements. But REDD+ is an important part of numerous developing countries and NDCs. As previous speakers alluded to, the forest sector is an important source of emissions and also source of sinks. So it's really vital to include it in broader natural climate solutions to get to a 2-degree world. And in terms of climate teams, one point I've heard Susie make many times in the past is that an advantage of this approach is that it can build off of what host countries are already doing. And numerous developing countries are investing in REDD+, have invested in REDD+, and in many cases have already achieved measurable, reportable, and verifiable reductions from REDD+. And so the challenge now is not proof of concept with REDD+, it's really how to expand it to larger jurisdictional or national programs. And so one of the advantages of the climate teams model, including REDD+, is that the type of sustained cooperation that Susie described can help host countries address the capacity challenges needed to get from where they are now with successful REDD+ programs in certain areas of the country to much larger implementation of REDD. And we call that in the red field, scaling up REDD+ or achieving REDD+ reductions at scale. And typically with REDD+, there is an investment upfront in the capacity, as well as a commitment to purchase reductions ex post. And that type of cooperation that we've seen in current models, both in bilateral and multilateral forums, relates well to the climate teams concept. So some similarities that we see between climate teams and existing REDD+ models are the multiple buyers. So for example, in the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, there are multiple buyers who have committed to providing both capacity investment and to purchase reductions through results-based payment criteria. And then similarly to the climate teams model, there's also a capacity building plan that both host countries and seller countries commit to. Some of the differences are that we've not seen large-scale transfer in REDD+ yet, so that would be a key difference between climate teams and current models of REDD+ cooperation. And then another difference is this multi-sectoral aspect and the opportunity, I think, to really mainstream REDD+ and the forestry sector alongside other key sectors of a host country climate plan. Another difference has to do with pricing and the demand signal. We haven't seen really a large scale demand signal from countries, from buyer countries on REDD+ yet. And so that could make it appealing for host countries to invest the time of government officials to invest their own funds and capacity in that scale up. And then lastly, there's the opportunity for price negotiation. What we've seen in models of REDD+ cooperation under the World Bank and under emerging facilities such as Emergent is that prices tend to range from $5 to $10 a ton. And we're increasingly hearing from REDD+ countries that this does not cover their costs. And so a climate teams model provides that opportunity for negotiation that Susie described. And I think also importantly, it could provide perhaps a higher price that could compensate the developing country for the opportunity cost of transferring that reduction overseas as opposed to using it toward its own NDC. And then I guess to quickly conclude here, I think subnational entities are an important consideration. So in many REDD+ countries, implementation is based on a state or provincial approach. And then similarly in buyer countries, regulated entities are increasingly interested in the co-benefits provided by forest carbon. And so climate teams presents an example where supplying provinces or subnational entities could be rewarded for their good performance. And on the buyer side, buyers would have access to carbon benefits that have not just the carbon atmospheric benefits, but also co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, community development, rural development, indigenous peoples' rights, et cetera. And then lastly, a few final thoughts. Obviously, any transfer involving REDD+ would need to meet the guidance under the Paris Agreement, especially for Article 6.2. And we believe that guidance to meet the environmental integrity criteria can be negotiated between countries in individual agreements. It doesn't necessarily have to have REDD+ specific guidance under the UNFCCC, and we have a lot of third-party standards and examples to draw from in meeting the environmental integrity criteria. So to conclude, I'd like to say REDD+ is ready, and forests are a key part of a 2-degree path, and Climate Teams offers a model where sustained cooperation can really help to scale up REDD+ and hopefully get us on a better path globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. Let me start with a few questions to the panelists, and let me address the first one to Rodrigo. What are the, in your view, Rodrigo, what are the key challenges for a middle-income country like Chile to engage in this kind, the kind of cooperation envisaged as a part of the climate teams? The first part, and secondly, how do you address the risk of a long-term commitment being made by a government like Chile and unforeseen developments that take place in the economy. Example, of course, being the pandemic and totally unanticipated impact on the economy and its effect on the longer term emission trajectory. So challenges to a middle income country for participating. Secondly, unanticipated impacts.
Thank you very much, Chandra. Well, I'll deal with the second question first, which is that obviously nobody can foresee immense economic or sanitary shocks as we're seeing with the pandemic. However, in the case of Chile, what we've seen is very long-term policies with reputational concerns and a very committed type of policies, particularly in the economic and environmental field in the last 20 to 25 years. So regardless of shocks, I see once these commitments have been made, that these will be, regardless of the different governments that you have, that these will be fulfilled. With respect to the challenges, I think this is the key question. And what we see in Chile is different institutions trying to deal with this problem in different ways. And we need to be able to face the institutional problem by trying to coordinate these different institutions involved. Here, currently, we have the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of the Environment, the Ministry of Energy, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs involved with different perspectives, and we need a unifying approach, which I think will come soon. We have experiences of this. One experience with which Claudio mentioned was the energy experience, which has been a model for the world. And I think the main challenge now is to try and conceive of a long-term vision in which climate change team's approach will have a view, which will have a place. I think a good analogy, and Claudio mentioned that analogy, I think a good analogy in the case of climate change policy is free trade agreements. Chile initiated a policy during the 90s to considerably increase its accession to the world economy through three types of policies. One was unilateral free trade, the other one was bilateral agreements, and the other one was regional agreements. And I think a similar type of approach in the case of climate change is possible, in which you have a broad policy with the convention, regional bilateral agreements with countries, and policies within the case of Chile. And if the approach is given a broad outlook, coordinating the different institutions involved with a set out governance system, then I think we can participate and be an active player in the world on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Let me turn now to Claudio, because you've referred to the kind of broad framework that the government can set, but for the private sector to act. And Claudio, specifically, one of the questions from that we're getting for you is how, for instance, as an example, can this kind of an initiative accelerate the phase out of thermoelectric power generation or coal-based power generation? How do you see that happening within this broader kind of context?
Thank you. Well, as many of you might know, we agreed, well, Rodrigo was in government still with former Minister Rebolledo and former Minister Mena, and retirement of coal. And basically today, renewables, which have been expanding massively and are becoming basically the only new investment in new production. And coal is there still because, of course, it gives a 40% of production still safety and security to the system. But we're looking to retire coal as fast as it is possible. And what has become the constraint? The constraint is not any more generation. The constraint has more to do with the transmission capacity, which is actually a discussion which is quite common in other countries around the world. How do you introduce transmission because you have to bring renewables from new places. In our case, the Atacama Desert or wind from the coast regions, where thermoelectric power is concentrated in very specific regions. But if you look at the abatement curves and costs, we already have a commitment by the latest 2040, they'll be all shut down, but we see that this is happening much faster than that. And it would, again, depend on that constraint. So the question is, you see, again, the private sector acting because, let's say, the mining companies, which are large consumers in the north, are all overturning their contracts. So there is a demand side action in they are acquiring renewable electricity contracts. So the opportunity in accelerating is again how can we channel those abatement opportunities, the mitigation opportunities into new investments. The problem is now that the constraint has gone away from the generation sector into something which is harder to deploy, fast transmission. But so if you look at cost opportunities, and especially if you, in Chile, again, generation has been the fastest reducer in emissions, is where can you be effective quickly? And I go back to the example of transport or other areas. The same industry, the mining industry, is the largest electricity consumer, but also the largest diesel consumer. So where can we find quickly abatement and emissions reductions in the mining industry? And if we can collaborate, we can find them more quickly. So private action, if you bring in quality of regulation and long-term certainties, mining is also like energy, a long-term industry where you have large-scale investments, is the key factor why you can bring in a lot of capital, which means this turnover of technologies, which is again are low emissions. So we hope that we can again keep accelerating and keep the quality of our regulations in order to keep attracting the necessary investment to keep the pace at the scale and demand we need. Because again, if you look at the total emissions in the case of Chile, coal is 28% of emissions, but oil and derivatives is 42% of emissions. How can we effectively address those? And especially because we can think again, I go back to the co-benefits of air quality, which, especially with diesel, I've never seen a clean diesel bus, really.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Axel, to you, a lot of the activity, as Claudia indicated, a lot of the investment by the private sector will be predicated on the certainty of financial flows through this kind of a cooperative mechanism. How do you see, or what do you see as the key financial risks in these kind of arrangements between countries?
Well, the key aspect, of course, is to generate trust that these contracts will be honored in the long term. Think about what happened in the early days of the CDM, when the companies were doing ERPAs for a long, or trying to get ERPAs for a long period, and were thinking, oh, we have a crediting period of altogether 21 years, and that means we'll have a revenue flow over that period. And then, as most projects were just ramping up, the big crisis struck and the price went down to zero. So I think this trust rebuilding, that now with climate teams, we can have a contractual link that is able to sustain for at least 10 years, if not 20 years, that also sustains over changes in governments, that sustains over crises that fall from the sky, and we'll see crisis coming. So I think, as you rightly say, in your climate market club, the key is about setting up the basics of good long-term contracting. And of course, this means that also one needs to have a clear view regarding, what actually can be sold. And that's why I brought up the long-term ambition-proof baselines. Because, we now see that at least from 2030 onwards, the curve will point downwards significantly. And this needs to be built in even already in the discussions now for a first phase of climate teams, because otherwise you'll get to a cliff after the first phase, and then it will be difficult to actually generate this level of trust.
Thank you, Axel. I know we are a little over time, but I wanted to ask Diana, her view on the extensive experience she has on the REDD+ side. Which are the countries you think are most attractive from an initiative of this kind, recognizing that preparing REDD+ type operations requires years of establishing a baseline. The FCPF readiness facility was intended for that, and we know that it's taken almost a decade to put in place the different arrangements for establishing the baseline, the MRV system, stop leakage. So from your perspective, where do you see the greatest opportunity as far as REDD+ is concerned for this kind of initiative under the Paris Agreement?
Great. Well, thanks for the question, Chandra. I'm definitely hesitant to name specific countries, but I would say that there are a group of countries that I think are generally considered leaders in the REDD field, spanning all regions, spanning Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And really what distinguishes leaders in the REDD field from those that are still preparing are the ability to manage the funds, to have the government infrastructure in place, and some experience with existing REDD+ initiatives, whether that's through the World Bank or whether that's through some of the bilateral and minilateral approaches that, for example, Germany, UK, and Norway have arranged on their own. And so I would say that that's really the consideration. You probably don't want to start a climate team with a country that hasn't yet gone through the process of already achieving MRV reductions from REDD+ through one of those programs. But at the same time, those programs provide a good foundation for scaling up.
Thank you, Diana, and you've highlighted the complementary nature of just these two programs that we talked about today. That something like the Climate Market Club is intended to facilitate building the institutions, the capacity, which then a much more ambitious a program like Climate Teams can facilitate the actual conversion of that into transactions. So, I hope that many of you will have the opportunity to discuss this further in the breakout group, and I'll hand over to Kelly to talk more about how that would work and to give concluding thoughts on what we've discussed till now. So over to you, Kelly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chandra. And thanks for leading such a great discussion, and thanks to all our panelists. I think what we're seeing here is that there's a real interest in moving forward with a coalition of the willing, and that there are ways that these kind of initiatives can nest into one another, right? There are all sorts of levels where we need to start to get these agreements going, where we need to start getting cooperation amongst the coalition of willing while we're waiting for agreement on the international rules, and that there's no reason to delay. In fact, it's quite urgent that we don't wait and see. We need to get this going now. So thanks for that discussion. We're a little bit over time, so I'm eager to get into the breakouts. Please put a message in the chat if you're not, if you haven't already selected a breakout. You will be randomly assigned, and I'm sure we can fix it afterwards if you find yourself in the wrong room or in a room where the discussions are being facilitated in a language you don't understand. So we can make sure that works. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you. Enjoy.
Tengo que ir a otro seminario ahora. ¿Tú vas a ir a alguno de los breakouts? Rodrigo, ¿me escucháis? No.
Sí, ahí te escucho, sí. Sí,
Ah, no.
pensaba ir al de, pero no sé cómo funciona, estaba justo viendo. No sé si estamos con todos o somos los dos nomás. No. Sí, no sé
Estamos
cómo
con varios más,
hacerlo.
pero yo, no, a mí me llegó.
Hi, is there a pop-up invitation that says join? The breakout, there should be a pop-up on your screen.
A pop-up, is that right? We're trying to see how to do it.
Yeah, so usually, Rodrigo, which one do you want to be in, the first one?
Yes,
Okay.
I think so. Is that the
Is there a
one?
pop-up on your screen?
Oh, right, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Claudio?
In my case, Nicolas is saying I have to actually go to another seminar, which I'm already late. So
Okay.
this is the virtual life. So I have to move on to the next one. And I wasn't able to say goodbye to either Susie or Francisco, so I'll have to send them an email. So if you happen to talk to them afterwards, please thank them very, very much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Claudio. I really appreciate it.
I'm sorry for having to leave, but it's an interesting discussion, and I would have loved to have plenty of more time, but it's always like that. Bye.
It's okay. Thank you so much. Bye. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you.